All right, we'll go ahead and get the car off the lift. We'll look under the hood for a little bit. And then the rest of the video we're gonna have to shoot when we finally finish everything in the car. But I figured what a great opportunity since I think all of our underneath jobs are done. All right, so one of the first things that might jump out at us is the fact that, well, one thing we noticed before, we had a couple issues with our battery mount. Number one, we were completely missing a battery hold down on this vehicle. That included the J-bolts, the wing nuts, and of course the main bracket. Now the bracket, we couldn't find that. It was back ordered everywhere we looked. So we went ahead and made our own by bending a piece of 16 gauge steel. We went ahead and cut out these notches for our terminals, had the holes drilled and everything measured for our J-bolts. And then I powder coated this black. So this isn't painted, this is powder coated. So it's gonna be nice and scratch free. It's not gonna chip or anything like that. I did line it with this material here, again, just to give it a little more insulation. The nice thing is the powder coat also gives it some insulation, but of course we notched everything out and it looks pretty close to what the factory would have had. I did add on our terminals too, I put a ground disconnect. These are my favorite. I use these on all my cars. These particular ones, and we'll link them in the video description, get them off Amazon. They're not terribly expensive, but they're good quality. They're a lot better quality than the ones you find at the local box stores. I also added some wiring here, which we'll show you from the other side, but this wiring goes to our battery tender. We added a C-Tech battery maintainer, and we've got the wiring over there where it can be very easily accessible by the owner. So they come in, they go ahead and hook the car up, and it'll maintain the battery. Now the nice thing about the way we wired it directly to these terminals on the battery, so you can run the maintainer with your battery disconnected. So you can cut power to the vehicle, but you can still have power to your battery maintainer. So you can maintain the battery while keeping the car electronics disconnected, which is a lot safer. All right, so I got my battery tender wires hooked up to our TR6 here that we're working on, and I've also got this battery cutoff switch. So right now the way I've got it wired is our switch is off, so there's no power to the car, but we can still run the battery tender. The wires go back behind the battery tray. They come out of a grommet on the side, and then they come up. I used one of the cable supports and added an extra one, have my wire that comes here so it doesn't go around the steering shaft. And I used a bolt for the windshield wiper motor, and then it comes around here, and you've got your end. And then all you gotta do is plug in the other end of your tender. So if you look right now, we've got 12.9 volts. That's a good battery. Let's go ahead and plug this in. All right, so we'll plug in our C-Tech. It'll start picking up some charge, and if we look over, even though our battery is disconnected from the vehicle, we're pulling a charge on the battery. So that's what we've done tonight. We did pull our valve cover off, our rocker cover, and we installed a silicone gasket. That was a nice piece that we put on. The reason for that is the cork gaskets are a one-time use. When you pull them off, you got to scrape them and replace them. And yeah, they're relatively inexpensive, but you got to have one on hand. So if you want to do something like adjusting the valves or checking the valve clearance, you got to be ready to go ahead and replace the valve cover gasket. With this aftermarket silicone gasket, it actually uses RTV to adhere to the alloy rocker cover, and then it will come off nice and easily, and it's reusable many times. And we went ahead and did do a valve adjustment on this vehicle. You can kind of see down in there, you can see the rocker shaft and some of the rocker arms. And I had noticed when I was running the vehicle before we started the work on it that the valves were a little clattery. Now they're always a little clattery on these old engines, but this was more so than usual. And so what I found was that a number of the valves were quite a bit loose. We tightened them to spec. I forget what the spec is. I'll pull it out of the book and put it on the screen. But you want a light drag, and the big thing is not to over tighten them, because you can end up with a burnt valve if you do that. So it's kind of one of those things that it's easy to read in the book, but it's still by feel. You want light drag on your feeler gauge. We went ahead and did all that. It sounds nice now. Now, one interesting thing when I replaced the gasket, the silicone gasket is thicker, and as a result, the original cap nuts that went on here, they had little plastic spacers. And those plastic spacers, if you put them on, there'd be no thread left. Well, if you took them out, you wouldn't be able to screw down the cap nuts. So I ordered new cap nuts that were a little longer, but even they were a little too long. So I went and got some nuts. These are fine thread. I think it's 5/16 24 is the thread. And we got stainless steel nuts that match up. Put those on, and then these cap nuts over top. So it's no big deal. You just take both off, but we went ahead and torqued all three of those to spec. And then we did also, and we're going to do a final polish with a rag just to clean it up. But we did polish this a little bit. So hopefully from the before and after, there's quite a difference. We, of course, got a little bit of greasy hands on it from doing some work. So we're going to do a final cleanup on that. And when we took this hose off, to take this off to remove the rocker cover, as it moved back, before I even got it off the nipple there, just a tiny bit of pulling it, it was enough to snap the old plastic T-fitting that was here. Just 50 years old and brittle, that's what happens. So I went ahead and replaced that with a brass T, and that'll be a lot stronger, pretty much last forever. And well, that's something to be aware of if you've got one of these cars and you're keeping all this stuff on it. Go ahead and get yourself one of those. I think it's a 1/2 inch brass T is what we used. We did replace the upper hose and the radiator cap. And while we were at it, since we were draining everything again, when in Rome, do other things, I went ahead and replaced the thermostat. I'm kind of glad I did, because it looked like an older thermostat that was in there. So now it's got a fresh thermostat, freshly sealed with a new gasket, new hoses, new clamps, new radiator cap, and completely fresh new coolant. So it's ready to cruise. Now I noted the lights and horn. Let me get my flashlight. And here is some of the wiring. Now it does look a little messy under there, I would say, but that's just the new loom that we did. That is the wiring that goes to those auxiliary lamps, and it's thicker wires. You can see we added 2 grounds, one for the horns and one for the lamps. And then anything that was exposed metal, we painted over to make sure we wouldn't have any rust. But those are some really nice grounds as opposed to what it was using before. And this wiring is just, a little extra wiring there. There's the inline fuses to the lamps, even though the other end of them is fused as well, just extra security. And in that bundle is a wiring harness to this horn. So as you can see, there's the old horn. And that's one of the horns. There's actually a second one. You see where that hole is? That's where the second one would mount. So we have the low and the high. If we decide ever, or the owner decides to replace those with originals, we have nice fresh wiring that we can hook up with those that go to a dedicated ground. So they'll be in as best shape as possible instead of using the original wiring. Now you might notice this arm here is disconnected, and it is on the other side as well. That's because there's something that goes here, and one of the reasons we're showing you this is because we can. Gimbal's going nuts. There's a shroud that covers all this. And that shroud is actually an old kind of cardboard. And again, 50 years old. We took it out successfully. The thing was completely taped up on either side from being ripped over the years. And when we went to put it back in, it just was falling apart. And I was like, why am I messing with that? So went ahead and ordered one. 30 bucks. Actually, it was 25 bucks for one of those. And you look under the hood of this vehicle or under the bonnet, and you're like, man, everything is like really clean, everything looks great. And then you would just see this taped up, messy shroud that, honestly could fall apart at any time and just have pieces get sucked into the radiator. So again, 25 bucks, that needs to be done. So one thing I noticed, this car had something common that people do is paint it black, send it to the track, right? Well, somebody painted the top of the radiator with some flat black paint just to clean it up. And they oversprayed on the old cap and also on this line. And we were replacing the cap anyway, so that cleaned that up. But I'm going to go ahead and have this line replaced. That's also coming with our shroud. Another couple dollars, and we'll have a brand new original line there, which will look a lot better. And also, if this one's older, it could crack over time, so we'll have a fresh one in there. While we had it out, we went ahead and cleaned the overflow bottle, and I polished the cap. So that looks nice and clean, and it's going to look really nice under the bonnet. And that's sort of the goal, is that we want everything under here to look really nice. So if this thing goes to a car show, you pop the bonnet. I mean, the paint's nice on it. The rocker cover is nice, everything's pretty clean, but there were just little things that were detractors, and we went ahead and took care of that, like cleaning up that cap on that bottle. Just something simple. It's the details that count. So here is our compressor for the air horns. That's right there where I'm kind of pointing with the flashlight. And as you can see here, this braided loom here, this is the wiring I added. This is the wiring that goes, the new wiring to the horn, that also goes across to the stock horns if we reinstate those, and also the wiring that goes to our auxiliary driving lamps. And what I did is I routed that along the original wire and taped it up with the high heat fabric tape. Now ignore this mess because, well, that's a whole nother story. We'll get back to that in a second. That all routes down under here, comes up, and here is where we have our 2 new relays that we put in. So what used to be here on the top was a single relay for the horn. I removed the horn relay because, like I said, we were getting a voltage drop out of it. And I could have bought a stock replacement, but I already had some automotive grade relays, and I wanted to replace the relay, which was originally just mounted back in here for the driving lamps, and it had like a really crappy ground. I went ahead and replaced that with brand new relay, mounted them up using the original bolts, or the original mounting points. I replaced the bolts with new hardware. So now we have 2 relays. This one is for our horn, and this one is for our driving lamps. And as you can see, even for our relays, we used a ground here. Now here, this wire is the wire that goes to our battery tender, and then we have that tucked up in there. So basically what you do, you're done driving the car, you pop the bonnet, reach in here, and you pull this out. There's your battery tender connector. When you're done, you want to go for a drive, you just tuck it up in there. It's nice and safe. You close the bonnet and you're good to go. You can see I like to leave myself notes. Always something I recommend if you're doing a job that you're not finishing all in one day. So I think I can tear these off. Torque the wheels. We're going to be doing that because we're getting new wheels and tires. So that's kind of overcome by events. And the coolant, we filled the coolant, but we do want to run the car and double check it when we're done. So good reminders that we had serviced those pieces and need to still double check them. Now ignition, we did a fair amount with the ignition. We put a new cap and rotor. We talked at length about that. We even had a separate video all about the red rotor cap and some of the things we found. We found a short in there. We found tons of bad wires. The ground wire from the distributor to our coil was cracked and broken. The internal ground wire from the base plate to the distributor was bad. And like I said, the rotor was showing signs of issues, and so was the cap. So we got an uprated cap, the red rotor. Spark plugs were nice and new. We took them out. We checked the gap. They were great. We put them back in. One of the things we did in the inspection anyway was a compression test. The engine has great compression, and it should run really well now. The coil looks new. There's no point in replacing that. I mean, it does look like a kind of generic aftermarket, which is a little bit of a bummer, but it should be fine, and we'll check that. So what we're going to still do on this, we're going to come in here. I just got to make sure that I route this where I'm happy. We're going to make sure everything's tight and ready to go. We'll make sure that all these plug wires are routed properly. We basically kind of fixed everything, made sure it was running, and then moved on to our valve adjustments. That's just some final cleanup we'll be doing under the hood. Another thing we'll be doing is our alternator. Now, when we first looked at the car, I don't know if you recall, but this wire here, actually, I replaced 2 wires, this one and this one. And this brown and yellow wire, which of course I didn't have that color in my stock, so I wrote on the thing here, if you pull it out, you'd see it's brown and yellow. It's, I think N is the color the book wiring diagram uses. But at any rate, when I took the electrical tape that was on there, I found this crazy contraption that had been put on that must have been a roadside repair that was forgotten about. All right, well, this one was worth grabbing the camera for. Now, we had a thing that we wanted to check. There was a wire coming out of our alternator that had a ton of electrical tape on it. I wanted to see what was behind it. As I started to pull the electrical tape off, this piece fell out. It was hardly crimped in at all. And then as I continued to take the tape off, the other end of the wire fell off. It actually broke right here. And just the pressure of removing electrical tape from the wire and holding the wire in the center, so we were putting very little pressure on either one of these ends, and they just slipped right out. This is what I found after I took off all the electrical tape. These are 1210 crimp connectors that look like they were haphazardly put together. The wires are loose in them. This is a wire connector, like a weather pack style connector, that's not even crimped very well on this end. And they just put it over that wire, and then it's a similar type connector on this end crimped onto this wire. So I'm really glad that we didn't just assume that wire was good and we actually pulled it off and took a look at it. Now that we see our loom here, we can go ahead and repair this wire. All right, so just an update. This brown and yellow wire appears to simply be the wire to our light on the dash. I'll continue checking, but what I can gather is that was some sort of really rough field repair, perhaps. But at any rate, we're going to fix that up and make it right. So as it turns out, this wire does in fact run the light on the dash. But more than that, the light itself and the load the incandescent bulb provides is actually used to trigger the field coils of the alternator. So with this wire broken, I don't believe the alternator would be charging. And that's more confirmation that this was most likely a roadside repair. So we had to repair this. Everything's crimped with proper crimps, and I use waterproof heat shrink on everything. What we're going to do here is we're going to loom this up. I basically pulled all the loom off and said, let's take a look at all the wires, make sure they're good, and we'll go ahead and clean them up. Now, we did a lot of wiring on this car, and we still got more to do in the dash. Now you might be thinking, well, hey, why don't you just replace the entire harness at this point? And I will tell you, it is close. There was a lot of issues with the wiring, but all in all, the wiring's not bad. It's usually the end pieces are just things that degraded over time. So we were able to fix everything, but if we found too much more, or if it has problems in the future, I'd probably be pretty close to recommending to the owner that maybe a long-term consideration would be a wiring harness replacement. And unfortunately, that's not trivial. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's a good solid day or two of work, and it's pulling everything cleanly, replacing it, plus probably a good $1,000 to $2,000 for a brand new, made harness. This car is not exactly the most complicated wiring. It's not as bad as our Jag over there, but it's still got a fair amount of wiring. So we weren't ready to jump to that conclusion yet. Everything I've found so far on the wiring has been repairable to good wires that are in good condition. So I think we're in good shape. All right, just an update. We cleaned up our alternator wiring. We put everything in some high temperature loom tape. Also rerouted our mechanical oil pressure gauge sender, because that was actually coming up over here and it was rubbing against our steering shaft. So we've now got that out of the way where it won't rub at all. So here's a pet peeve. When someone routes a line for an oil pressure sender and routes it in such a way that it rubs against the steering shaft, when they could have very easily gone underneath it and followed the same route other cables go. Now, in order to fix it, I'm going to have to take off the fitting and completely reroute this, because there's no way to get it under there without putting a zip tie on something else to hold it out of the way. Better. On our fuel filter down there, you can't really see it, but I added a little retainer bracket. Let me see if I can zoom in and show you. Oh, I also fixed the wiring to this sender here. This must be an oil pressure switch. And yeah, you can kind of see it down there. We put a little bridge on the hoses. Gonna have trouble focusing, but that's okay. You kind of get the gist of it. And we've tightened up all of our wires here. I also fixed anything that I found with a kind of insulated terminal. All of them were pretty loose, like they often are, because people usually just use regular pliers to crimp them down. They don't crimp properly. I put uninsulated ones on, and then I like to follow them up with a adhesive-lined waterproof heat shrink. And those are ground, so I didn't cover them. Sometimes what I like to do is come in, like you've seen here, I'll actually take non-adhesive heat shrink and cover them and just sort of make like a protective covering, just like you'd have a plastic piece from the factory. And yeah, you can buy ones that already have insulation on them, but I kind of prefer to do it this way because then I don't have the insulation in the way of the crimp, and I know I get a solid crimp. I can visually and mechanically examine it, and then I have my heat shrink on the wire and I just go ahead and shrink it down. But these are all tight. All of our wires are tight. Distributor's good. I think we're pretty much all wrapped up under here. Well, of course, once we get our new hose and our new shroud, then we can finalize everything. But in terms of wiring underneath the bonnet, I think we're all set. Ooh, I left some conduit over there. I forgot I had stashed this here. This is what was originally on the alternator wiring, some kind of aftermarket split loom, which is nothing wrong with, but I replaced it with the high heat fabric tape, which I think makes it look a little closer to factory. This tape is made by Tessa, and it's good stuff. It's very adhesive, and it's also good for underhood temperatures. I'll post a link to it. They have a couple different versions. One of them's a low temp, which you can use for interior stuff. It's a little more fuzzy, and this stuff is a little less fuzzy, but it is good for high temperature applications. So I'll link to both of them. One more thing you may have caught was while we were able to get a replacement alternator harness cover, the spring clip retainer is not available. But no worries, we used some stainless spring steel rod and formed our own. It looks and functions exactly like the original. Gotta love the small details. And the new shroud and coolant tank line and grommet came, allowing us to finish things up under the bonnet. It really came out nice. And while the car looked great from the start, just comparing the before and after, you can see that these small jobs really had a big impact under hood. So that was pretty much everything under the bonnet. Now in the trunk, or the boot, got to speak in the right terms here, we had some problems with our lights staying on. So we went ahead and kind of came in here and took a look. And well, here's where you can at least see that tank that we were talking about. Let me peel back the carpet. All right, so I just pulled the carpet and our cover for our spare tire out, and a couple interesting things. So I mentioned the owner wanted to replace the wheels and tires. We'll show you what those are. I had actually talked to him on email about replacing the spare because it's not a bad idea to do if you're up for paying for it. And this one would work. The tires I chose are very close in diameter to this, so you could drive on the spare if you needed to. But this is what I found. The new tires are wider, and if you look, here is the aftermarket tank. Right here, see, that's the aluminum fuel tank that's in it. Now originally, the steel tank would have had an indentation there, and you can even see there's an indentation in this cover. Well, what that would allow is you could actually put a wider spare tire back here. Well, we lost that because of this aluminum tank. And even look at this, it's pressing down on the tire, the stock tire. And the stock tire actually is not even full. So I'm going to fill this tire with some air and see if it'll hold. As you can see there, that aluminum alloy tank, it's a great add-on, but it interferes with the placement of the spare tire. So that's problematic. And you certainly can't, if you wanted to, say you had a set of wider tires, you're pretty much stuck using the stock one if you want to have a spare. And if you need to put if you lose a tire and you need to put your spare, you're going to have to lay the other one and hope you have trunk room to fit it, because it ain't going to fit under there. So that's a bit of a bummer, and that's just the thing that happens when you modify a car from its original specs, whether it be the alloy tank or the wider wheels. There's always pros and cons, and that's just one of the things you're going to come up against. And in all honesty, modern tires nowadays, knock on wood, but they're pretty resilient. They're not like what they used to be, especially the old bias ply tires that would blow out or go flat all the time. They're a lot more reliable. Now, while we were back here, we did a lot of work on the lamps, and we have some pictures to show. We fixed some more grounds up in here. Again, more wiring. Again, it was just some simple things. It didn't take that long to repair, and replacing the entire harness would be a bear of a job and quite expensive, and I just frankly don't think that it needs it. I did add some extra grounds for our lamps. Even though they ground to the lamps, I added some extra. We have some pictures of that. And basically what that did for us, it brightened up the lamps a little in the back and has made them a little more reliable. So we're in pretty good shape now. All right, so we still got a few more things coming for this car and a few more jobs to do. We're pretty much done with it up on the lift, and we're done with most of the mechanical work. We're going to focus on the interior. We're going to be putting LED bulbs behind the instruments, and we're also going to go ahead and remove the seats, and we're going to service the seat tracks, make sure they're greased up, make sure they move freely. And well, aside from that, we're going to put some door felts in, and then just basically kind of go over the car and make sure everything's nice and clean, make sure everything's looking good. We got a little bit of wiring still to clean up under the bonnet. We got our shroud to put in, but the bulk of our work is done. All right, so we'll add a little more to this video as we get the rest of this car done, and we'll wrap it up. It's probably going to be a long video because, well, we've done a ton here. So I'm going to have to figure out how to creatively edit it to not make it an hour and a half, or split it up into multiple videos. So I hope you enjoyed this. If for some reason this becomes the end of the video, do us a favor, drop us a like and a subscribe, because if you like what you saw here, well, we've got plenty more coming on Vortex Garage.